Hey guys, coming at you today with everything I have learned about my protein sparing bread recipe that has the yeast in it that rises and proofs and puffs up in the oven. There has been so many questions. I mean, I have 1,500 comments on that video alone, but I mean, maybe a third of those are from me, like replying to people. But there has been so many questions and there has been so many things that I have learned since doing this bread at different locations and in different size quantities, like not just one loaf at a time, like trying to do 6 at a time. One loaf at a time is way easier than 6 for sure. Like it's a lot easier to do it with one, like insanely easier. Doing a 6 times batch is really hard because you don't know how much to whip it. There's less of a chance of error when you're doing one loaf at a time. So these things are things that I encountered because I was trying to do it 6 times. And I would have never known this stuff if I had just stuck to doing it one time in my small KitchenAid mixer. So these are the little things that could be messing up your bread, even though there's a less likely chance of it messing up your bread than it did messing up my 6 times loaf. I try to get this done while he's sleeping. I have my monitor here because he's upstairs. So I might be checking that frequently because I have it on mute because it will register when he cries. I'll see it on there, but I won't hear it because I have the sound turned off. So that's if I'm looking over that way, that's why. Okay, so starting with one of the first and last things I just learned about this bread. I'll show you up on the screen what yeast I used to get. It was Hosier's Hill or something like that. Like I've gotten their Allulose before. I've gotten I think I get their heavy cream powder, but I used to get their Active Dry Yeast. Well, this time it wasn't available. So I got the vacuum packed, like hard bricks of Active Dry Yeast that when you cut them open, they were vacuum sealed, so they puff up, and the difference in time it takes for this yeast to start blooming and the other yeast to start blooming is night and day. Like I used to have to wait a long time for that first kind of yeast to bloom and get kind of frothy. This one gets twice as frothy in half the time. So the yeast does matter. And I know people have used rapid rise yeast. There is a calculation on Google you have to search. There's different things you have to do for that kind of yeast. I think you use less of it, and there might be one other thing that's different about it. But you can use it. You just got to make sure you look up the difference on Google because that's where I go for all my information. When you guys ask me a question that I don't know, I just go to Google because most of the time I don't know the answers because a lot of times I don't do all the experimenting. So if you ask me what to swap out for what, a lot of times I have to just Google it, and that's what I do. So you can use a rapid rise yeast. I know there's people in the comments that have done it, and it succeeded. So you just got to know the difference between the two. So that's what I always do first in my first step of the bread is I bloom the yeast with the inulin in the warm water. You need to have it between 100 and 110. I even have done it lower. It does take a little bit longer to bloom that way though. Another thing is you can use honey. I mentioned that in my first video. The measurement's a little bit different. I think it's 9 grams instead of 7 grams, but that's really it. I've been told the sugar gets eaten by the yeast and there's no carbs in it. You can carb count it if you want. It's not a lot still because you're using such a tiny amount among 16 slices of bread, so it's not a ton. You can also use maple syrup. Someone in my comments said that monk fruit erythritol worked. I can't attest to that, and I feel like I tried, and that was not the case for me. But it could be possible. I have tried allulose, and it didn't work for me. So you can do your own experimenting, but in my findings, I found it did not work. You can also just use regular sugar if you really want to, if you're so inclined. You can do whatever you want. Just using the inulin blooms it with no carbs because inulin is a fiber. And too much inulin can cause digestive upset in some people, just so you know. But 9 grams or 7 grams is like a teaspoon, so it's not a lot, especially over the whole loaf of bread. Now, after you do that, the next part is the dry mix. So using egg white powder, You can use any kind of egg white powder you want, as long as it says there's only egg whites in it. Now, if you've seen some of my weekly updates, you know that I used to get this brand. I'll put it here. And for some reason, now it's not working. Pun not intended. It's now brand, but it's not working. I don't know why. When I first started experimenting with this bread a year ago, I used this because it was a cheaper option. It was a big tub of it, and I was going through a lot of it. So I used it. Now I have 6 tubs, and I threw out a bunch, and now I have to test all these other tubs because they're not whipping up like they're supposed to. So if you watch my videos and you see how stiff, especially if you check out the video that I just did not too long ago, the hamburger buns and Italian herb rolls, you'll see how thick this egg white batter gets. If it doesn't get that thick, there's something wrong. First, maybe the egg whites. I had no idea until I finally got a batch of my egg whites powder that I normally use and tried it, and it worked perfectly. And I was like, great. So it's the egg whites. So that could always be an issue. I use Roseacre Farms. They only come in 10-pound or more buckets. And then I use bulk supplements, which worked. I'm guessing It's Just will work. I've used their products in the past, and it always worked for me. I can't attest to any other brands, but I know those ones work, and just try to see if it has anything else added to it. The Now brand says it has BCAAs, which I'm guessing are like amino acids. Yeah, they're branch chain amino acids. So I'm guessing they are adding something maybe to it that is messing up the recipe. Now, this egg white powder, the Now brand, it does whip up like regular egg whites without all the other ingredients in it. So you can't test that way. That's what I was gonna try to do with all the buckets. If it didn't whip with just water, then it would be garbage. Well, it whips with just water. So I have to test literally every one with a single batch of bread. So that's what I'm going to do eventually if I have to. Right now, I bought another 50-pound box of the Roseacre Farms. Last time, the reason I got the Now brand was because they didn't have it last time. When I tried to buy it back in February, I went to the site and tried to add it to my cart, and it wouldn't. So I'm guessing they were low on stock or something, and I couldn't even get like a 10-pound box. So that's why I got the Now brand in the first place. So, and it was the cheapest at the time. So cheapest isn't always the best option. And another thing I learned is that you can add the psyllium husk, egg white powder, allulose, cream of tartar, and salt all at once. The psyllium husk, the whole psyllium husk, if you use powder, you have to use half the amount. In the original video, back like 2 years ago, or no, a year and a half ago, I said that you had to add the psyllium husk to the water, but you actually don't. You can just add it all at once and it'll be fine. The reason you have psyllium husk in there is without it, it whips up just fine. Everything else works. But when you go and proof it, the allulose seeps out of the egg white and creates a wet bottom, so that when you bake it, it becomes super hard and rubbery. I forgot the psyllium husk in one of my 6 times batches at the bakery, and I literally had to throw out all the loaves because actually I think I used them for samples because I just cut off the entire bottom of the loaf. The inside was fine, but the bottom was hard and rubbery from all the allulose. So I found that allulose doesn't like to stay suspended in egg whites for some reason. All these sweeteners are completely new to me, just like they are to you guys. So it's like, I've been doing this for 3 years and I'm still learning stuff about these sweeteners. And more sweeteners keep coming out, of course. So there's more to learn. So eventually I will have a sweeteners video. But right now, allulose is what makes it brown. I heard that glycine also makes it brown. But if you don't use allulose, you can sub in a different sweetener just to give it a little bit of sweetness. But allulose is 70% less sweet than sugar. So that's why we add 60 grams to the whole loaf. You can add as much as you want or as little as you want. But that's the sweet spot for me, I feel like. So if you're adding a monk fruit erythritol, I would add less than what I would normally do for allulose, because monk fruit erythritol is the exact same sweetness as sugar. So if you don't want it super sweet, you don't want to add the same amount of monk fruit erythritol or just straight erythritol to your mix. You could also just add a couple drops of stevia instead if that's what if you're not looking for the browning. You're not going to get browning if you add monk fruit erythritol or stevia, but you will get the little bit of sweetness that us Americans know white bread to be. It's sweet to us. The other thing I found that allulose does besides browning is that it makes it softer. So your egg white bread might not be as soft and fluffy as my egg white bread is. Go check out Indigo Nilly. She has tons of different things she adds to make her bread loaf super soft and fluffy. So she still adds the allulose, but she adds a lot less than I do, and she puts other things in it. So go check her out. I'll link her down in the description box. She has tons of egg white bread videos. So if you're looking for something else, check that out because she has tons. Okay, so psyllium husk powder, or whole psyllium husk. I told you the reason we add it. Now, for substitutes, there's been people that have asked glucomannan, I think is how you say it. I've never tried it, but I'm thinking that a fiber can maybe be swapped for another fiber. That's all psyllium husk is a fiber, all fiber. So if that's the case, then some other fiber supplement that you use might work in this. I have not tried it myself though. So that might be an experiment down the line. I'm not sure. I know other people I think have done it and said it works. I can't remember though. I went through probably over 150, 200 comments on my video to kind of get this list compiled of questions and answers and stuff, but I did not happen to see one where they said it worked. So I'm not positive, but I'm guessing a fiber of some kind would work instead of the psyllium husk. So that takes care of the allulose, the egg white powder, and the psyllium. Salt and cream of tartar. I've heard Indigo Nilly uses more cream of tartar. It makes for a different kind of loaf. I think it makes it softer or something. So definitely go check her out. I just stick with the normal amounts for it. The salt, I have found, I use Himalayan pink sea salt. She uses Redmond's salt. So I've heard different things about Redmond's. I think it's a little bit too minerally. I have had two different kinds of Himalayan pink sea salt, like the fine ground. I bought one on Amazon. I could feel the granules when I ate my bread. So I stopped using that. I use it at home now just to season my food because it's less noticeable in like whole dishes. And I bought one at BJ's. So you're just going to have to experiment with that if that's something that happens to you. They look fine enough to me, but then you go and put it in something and it's not. So you're just going to have to experiment with different brands of Himalayan pink sea salt or the Redmond real salt or whatever you use. Now, while that's whipping, getting the pans ready. Now, I have nonstick 9.5 by 5.5 loaf pans. Indigo Nilly uses bigger ones. So I've never been able to find bigger ones, but mine have like a nonstick coating on them. And when I use them without parchment, they don't shrink at all because they kind of stick to the sides, but don't stick to the sides. So I actually found it was better to use no parchment. But as soon as I used my pans 30 times, they started sticking too bad and making my loaf like black on the outside, like have speckles of black. So I couldn't do that anymore. So I still use the parchment paper and I spray it. But just a sprayed nonstick pan will probably be fine for 50 loaves or 30 loaves, of yours. I can't do that anymore because I made so much that all my pans got to the point where I couldn't not parchment them anymore. Some people said to season them like a cast iron. I haven't tried that yet. I just haven't had the time. But maybe covering them in oil and heating them up super hot, maybe that would help make them non-stick again and make for a better loaf. I just haven't tried it yet. So that's an option too. Glass dishes, I would definitely line with parchment paper. But that's what I do while it's whipping, is after I add all those ingredients, I whip it up and I do my pans. And then for the fat at the end that I use, I stuck to not using butter powder because I was annoyed that I would have to sift it because I have to it's already a difficult recipe and I don't even want to have to sift anything. So unfortunately now though, the heavy cream powder I have to sift it because I'm having trouble adding it without my egg whites deflating too much. So it's always easier to add the cream powder or butter powder with sifting because you'll have less clumps that way. when you go to mix it, and you won't have to mix it as long, which will hopefully make your batter not deflate too much. You can use, like I said in my blog post, I'm sure MCT oil powder would work, butter powder, heavy cream powder, buttermilk powder, whole milk powder, goat milk powder, coconut milk powder. Tons of different options you can add instead of the heavy cream powder. I just stuck with what I knew and what was good and what I liked in my bread. It tasted good, and it was something that I could get a hold of easily, and it wasn't insanely expensive. Of course, now if I have to rebuy it, it probably will be way more expensive than the last time I bought it, but it is what it is. But there are a lot of alternatives that you can use. Also, Indigo Nilly uses the egg yolk powder, which is also like, basically you just want to add some kind of fat to make it softer and like more not styrofoamy, I guess. But the yeast takes care of that a lot, so I have debated on even leaving the heavy cream powder out. I haven't done it yet, but I may do that in the future also to see what happens. Okay, now to the actual whipping of the egg whites. There are a couple of reasons why your egg whites wouldn't whip. One, I already discussed, it could be the egg whites. Second, your bowl could not be clean. So using plastic, a lot of times if it's not super clean, it could hold on to oils, and the oils make it not able to whip. There's also, if you use a hand beater, there's some people that do it. There is one person that did a video in their RV. They don't have a KitchenAid. They used a hand mixer, and it beat up for them. But if you have a certain one that doesn't go fast enough, it might not work. It needs a certain amount of power to get the egg whites to whip, and it might still work. It just might take 30 minutes. Like now, my big mixer, because my speed 2 is so slow, it takes me 15 minutes to whip up 6 times batch in my mixer. When on my regular mixer, KitchenAid, doing 1 times batch, it takes maybe 8 minutes at the most. So the time of whipping could range from 5 minutes all the way up to 30 if you have a really slow hand mixer, and it still might not even work. You have to have a certain amount of power in order to get these egg whites to whip up correctly and to the stiffest peaks. If it doesn't whip up much, it may sink, and it will probably not be as big of a loaf. So there's under whipping, which is what happens most often, I feel like. And then there's over whipping, which I haven't heard of anybody really over whipping, but I have definitely over whipped. I found that I did that in my 6 times batch. He's crying. I should probably go get him, or at least give him a binky. Hold, please. Back. The only time I've over whipped it in a 1 times batch was when I was literally trying to test this orange bucket of egg white, and I just kept letting it go, and it wasn't getting stiff. And sure enough, I was over whipping it still, but it's because it just never got to stiff peaks like it should have. So it's really hard for you to over whip it doing a 1 times batch. Me doing a 6 times batch, overdoing it by 2 minutes, because I watch it to rise, and then I noticed it was going down, and I stopped it. So that's how I realized I kind of overbeat it. If you overbeat it or underbeat it, when you put the heavy cream powder in it and whip it, it deflates really easily. So if you get it right in that sweet spot and you put your heavy cream powder in and you just mix it a little bit until the heavy cream powder is actually incorporated and it doesn't deflate really bad, you're good. I've had it where I didn't mix the heavy cream powder in all the way, so then I would like hand mix it and it would deflate. But if you have it just right, if you have the egg whites whipped up to the right amount, I can whip it way more and get the heavy cream powder actually incorporated, and it doesn't deflate like at all. And I end up having my pan full. Indigo Nilly's was way less because she has a bigger pan. So you also got to take that into consideration. But every time I do it, I know where my egg white batter should come to on my pan. So I know if I did it correctly or not. It took me a long time to figure out what was incorrect about it, because it would be just not filling my pan up. And I didn't know if it was over whipping or under whipping, or if I whipped the heavy cream too much. But if you whip it just right, the heavy cream powder shouldn't deflate your egg whites too bad. They should still be pretty stiff. That's one of the reasons why your egg white bread won't come out right, is if it's underwhipped or overwhipped and deflates too much. If it comes out perfect the way it needs to, and then you go and proof it, and it should get taller and it should get the nice crust on top. If it doesn't do that, like I found that if I underwhipped it or overwhipped it or whipped the heavy cream powder too much, I found that the top of it didn't get nice and hard and crusty and like was too mushy almost. And it did rise a little bit, but it never rose as much as when it was like perfectly done. So that's another thing you can look for. But then when you go and score it and you put it into the oven, I've cooked it at so many different temperatures for so many different amounts of time that it's hard for me to pinpoint for you guys really. Like just follow my original recipe. Obviously, it was like 325 for 32 to 38 minutes, I think it was. But if you absolutely don't want it to sink and you think you've done it wrong, leave it in the oven with the oven off. The crust will be a little bit too done and a little bit too tough, but your bread won't sink and it won't get like styrofoam inside. It'll stay soft and fluffy. I've been eating some of those loaves that have ended up like that. So that's how I know it works to keep your bread from sinking in. It's not the best though. So if you just happen to have done it wrong and you want to save it, you can try that and it won't sink on you. Now, if you overwhipped it or underwhipped it too much, you might still not get the nice fluffiness inside. It all depends. I've also found that just baking it longer than you think will help for it to not to sink as much. But like I said, sometimes I've pulled it out of the oven at 40 minutes and it still sank on me. So the sinking thing, and Van is awake again. Not quite. I can hear the cats running back and forth. Like I said in my one weekly update, that I used the bad egg whites that didn't whip up, and I know they weren't big enough because I put them in my pan and it was way low, like level wise, and I knew, I'm like, this bread isn't going to come out. And I baked it and it came out of the pan and it didn't sink. So unfortunately, I really have not figured out exactly why the bread sinks, because it's just so all over the board. If you do it perfectly, it won't sink on you. But that is people's biggest complaint, pretty much in the comments, is that my bread sank or sucked into nothing and what did I do wrong? And it can literally be a million things. Like, and I have a feeling that the weather has something to do with it also. Egg whites are tricky. Even just making meringues or making angel food cake or making a sponge cake, like egg whites are a pain in the butt. And here we're trying to put yeast in it and make it rise and make a bread loaf out of it. So you're going to have some complications for sure. Egg whites are a pain. They were like the bane of my existence back in pastry school even. Like, they are so finicky. It's ridiculous. So I'm sorry if you're having trouble with this egg white bread, but I'm here to try and help you in some way or another. But so this is pretty much everything I have learned about making a loaf of egg white bread. Okay, I'm sitting here editing my egg white bread video, and there's one thing that's kind of important that I forgot to talk about, and that was proofing this bread. Now, in the video that I shot, I did have COVID, so when I explained the whole proofing of the egg white bread on top of the stove or in front of the stove, people were very confused. What I did was put it on the stove top in front of the hot air that was blowing out of my preheating oven. And that proofed the bread. So it was on top of my stove, on the burners, but just in front of the fan. That was the ventilation for the oven. So it was hot air blowing out and proofing the bread. I found now the easiest way is to do a dehydrator at your lowest setting of 105. That's what I do now in the bakery. I have 2 dehydrators so that I can put a bunch of bread in at once. But anything that is a temperature of around 105 is good. Most bread proofs at a lower temperature. I just found 105 is like the perfect. So I think that is now it. And you can't overproof this bread. So don't proof it for longer than an hour and 20 minutes because it will implode on you if you proof it too long. Back to the video. Now, add-ins. I have had several comments saying they put cinnamon sugar in between the batter, and they added raisins, and they added olives, and they added spices, and they added this and that. So it is possible. I've never done it because I just haven't had the time, but it is possible. And there's people that, like I did with my Italian herb rolls, you can pretty much do whatever you want on top of them. I let them get a little bit cooked in the oven, and then I brush them with butter, and you can put onions on them. You can put seasonings. You can put cheddar. You can put jalapenos. You can put poppy seeds. You can put sesame seeds. You can make it sweet. You can make it savory. So there are a lot of things you can do with it. And there's a lot of people that have done recipes with the egg white bread and made it into danishes and made it into this and that. Mine is a little bit different because we're proofing it. He's awaking again. I can actually hear him. But I actually proof it, so it makes it a little bit harder to figure out how to do add-ins and what can be added and what can't and in what stage. I just know it's easiest to cook it a little bit, brush it, and add something to the top of it. I haven't tried proofing any kind of ingredients inside the bread yet. So that is something I had planned on doing last year, but things got a little crazy. So I haven't had a chance. But I definitely will be experimenting with this at some point. One final thing. Making other shapes. Now, like I showed you, using different pans, you can make buns and rolls and stuff like that. If you don't have those, what I did, I made tinfoil molds on parchment paper, sprayed it, and put my mixture in that and let it proof. It worked. I made hoagie rolls. I made a pizza. It's not the best because it's not really chewy enough. It's still too bready, but I've made a whole pizza crust. I bake it a little bit, add toppings, bake it some more, and it's decent. But it's not pizza crust like I want it. So I think that's about it for this egg white bread. I'll be putting in other things if I think of them as I'm editing this video. But I hope you guys enjoyed and this helps you out a little bit. Let me know by giving it a thumbs up. Thank you for subscribing. And as always, I'll be back with another keto video. Bye, guys.